entitled Officer Harasses' black driver, then gets the shock of his life. The roar of the engine was the only sound Officer Miller hated more than the sight of a beat-up sedan in his patrol zone. It was late, nearly 1 a.m., and the rain was coming down in sheets, blurring the neon signs of the city's less reputable establishments. Miller, a man whose authority had long surpassed his actual achievements, watched the sedan from his rearview mirror. The driver hadn't committed any infraction, not yet, but something about the car, the way it seemed to slink through the shadows, rubbed him the wrong way. "Dispatch, this is Unit 12, requesting backup at the intersection of Elm and Vine. Possible, suspicious vehicle." Miller's voice crackled over the radio, laced with a thinly veiled disdain. He activated his lights, the sudden flash cutting through the rain like a hostile strobe. The sedan pulled over smoothly, almost too smoothly, in Miller's estimation. He watched in the mirror as the driver, a black man, rolled down his window. Miller adjusted his hat, a practice move designed to intimidate, and stepped out into the downpour. The rain plastered his uniform to his skin, but he didn't care. He was in control here. "License and registration," Miller barked, his tone leaving no room for argument. The driver, calm despite the circumstances, reached into his glove compartment. "Officer, is there a problem?" His voice was even, a stark contrast to Miller's aggressive posture. Miller sneered. "That's for me to decide. Just give me the documents." The driver handed over the requested items. Miller snatched them, his eyes scanning the license. "Jamal Thompson, huh? What's a guy like you doing out this late?" Jamal's expression didn't change. "I was visiting a friend." "Is there a curfew I'm unaware of, officer?" Miller's eyes narrowed. The nerve of this guy, talking back to him. He knew how to handle this. "Step out of the car, Mr. Thompson. I need to ask you a few questions." Jamal hesitated for a split second, just enough for Miller to perceive it as defiance. "Officer, I haven't done anything wrong. I'd prefer to stay in my vehicle, out of the rain." "That wasn't a request, Mr. Thompson." Miller reached for his baton, the metallic click echoing in the night. "Now step out of the car, or I'll make you." Jamal sighed, a sound that grated on Miller's nerves. He opened the door and stepped out, his hands raised slightly. The rain immediately soaked through his thin jacket, plastering it to his frame. "Now, Mr. Thompson," Miller began, his voice dripping with condescension, "let's talk about why a man like you is driving around in this part of town at this hour." The backup siren was now audible in the distance. Miller smirked. This was going to be fun. He just didn't know that his entire world was about to flip upside down. Jamal Thompson was not who Officer Miller perceived him to be. Beneath the unassuming jacket and the calm demeanor resided a sharp mind and a quiet resolve forged in the crucible of systemic injustice. He was a rising star at one of the city's top law firms, a Harvard Law graduate who had chosen to return to Cincinnati to fight for those who couldn't afford expensive legal representation. His current case was particularly challenging, a class-action lawsuit against the Cincinnati Police Department for racial profiling. Jamal had spent months collecting data, interviewing victims, and building a case that could potentially dismantle the department's discriminatory practices. He knew the risks and the potential for backlash, but he was driven by a deep-seated belief in justice and equality. His apartment, a modest but meticulously organized space overlooking the Ohio River, was a testament to his dedication. Bookshelves overflowed with legal texts, academic papers, and volumes on civil rights history. His walls were adorned with photographs of Thurgood Marshall, Rosa Parks, and other icons of the civil rights movement, silent reminders of the battles fought and the battles yet to come. Tonight, he had been visiting his mentor, Mrs. Eleanor Reynolds, a retired civil rights attorney who had paved the way for lawyers like him. She had been instrumental in shaping his understanding of the law and instilling in him a fierce commitment to justice. Their conversations were always a blend of strategy, history, and personal anecdotes, fueling Jamal's determination to make a difference. He knew the dangers of being a black man in America, especially one who dared to challenge the status quo. He had been stopped before, questioned, and even harassed. But he had always maintained his composure, knowing that any perceived aggression would be used against him. His girlfriend Aisha, a talented journalist, worried constantly about his safety. She had seen firsthand the toll that fighting against injustice could take, the threats, the intimidation, the constant fear. She urged him to be careful, to prioritize his safety, but Jamal refused to back down. He knew that silence was complicity, and he couldn't stand idly by while others suffered. As he stood in the rain, facing Officer Miller, Jamal knew that this was more than just a routine traffic stop. It was a test, a reminder of the power dynamics at play. He could feel the weight of history on his shoulders, the expectations of his community, and the unwavering belief in his ability to make a difference. He just needed to play his cards right. The backup unit arrived, sirens blaring, illuminating the scene with an almost theatrical intensity. 2 more officers, both white and mirroring Miller's aggressive demeanor, emerged from the vehicle. Jamal felt a knot tighten in his stomach. The situation was escalating rapidly. "What's going on here, Miller?" one of the officers asked, his voice dripping with mock concern. "Just a routine stop, Johnson," Miller replied, his eyes never leaving Jamal. "But Mr. Thompson here seems a little uncooperative." Johnson smirked, sizing Jamal up with a dismissive glance. "Well, let's see if we can change that." He approached Jamal, his hand resting on his holstered weapon. "Mr. Thompson, why don't you tell us what you're doing out here tonight?" Jamal took a deep breath, maintaining his composure. "I told Officer Miller I was visiting a friend. I have nothing to hide." "Visiting a friend? At this hour? In this neighborhood?" Johnson's voice was laced with skepticism. "Who exactly were you visiting?" "That's not relevant," Jamal retorted, his voice firm. "I have a right to privacy." Miller stepped forward, his face inches from Jamal's. "You have no rights here, Thompson. Not until you start cooperating." "I am cooperating," Jamal insisted. "I've given you my license and registration. I've answered your questions. What more do you want?" "We want the truth," Miller snarled. "And the truth is, you look like trouble. You're in the wrong place, at the wrong time." "That's your opinion, officer," Jamal replied, his voice unwavering. "And I'm entitled to it." Miller's patience snapped. He grabbed Jamal's arm, his grip tight and painful. "That's it. You're under arrest for obstruction of justice." Jamal flinched, but he didn't resist. He knew that any physical altercation would only escalate the situation further. "You have no grounds to arrest me," he protested. "I haven't done anything wrong." "Tell it to the judge," Miller sneered, shoving Jamal towards the police car. Johnson and the other officer flanked him, their expressions grim. As they reached the vehicle, Jamal knew he had to act. He had to make them realize who they were dealing with before it was too late. He took another deep breath, trying to stay as calm as possible. He reached into his inside jacket pocket slowly. "Officers, before you take me anywhere, there's something you should know," Miller scoffed. "Oh yeah? What's that, Thompson? Gonna tell us you're the mayor's son?" Jamal pulled out his wallet, opened it, and held it out for them to see. "Something like that." He revealed his badge, its gold surface gleaming in the flashing lights. It identified him as an investigator with the Cincinnati Police Department's Internal Affairs Division. The 3 officers froze, their faces draining of color. The realization washed over them like a bucket of ice water. They had just arrested one of their own, and not just any officer, but someone with the power to investigate their every move. The smugness vanished, replaced by a chilling wave of fear. Miller's grip on Jamal's arm loosened slightly. He stammered, his voice losing its earlier arrogance. I don't understand. What's going on?" Jamal kept his voice measured and even. "I'm conducting an investigation into allegations of racial profiling within the department. And tonight, gentlemen, you just provided me with Exhibit A." He slowly retracted his badge. The rain continued to fall, now washing away not only the grime of the city but also the veneer of authority that these officers had so readily wielded. The shock on their faces was almost comical, But Jamal felt no amusement. He felt a cold, hard resolve. I'm going to need your names, badge numbers, and a detailed account of everything that happened here tonight, Jamal continued, his voice cutting through the silence. And I assure you, this will not be the end of it. The power dynamic had shifted completely. The hunter had become the hunted. The aftermath of the revelation was immediate and chaotic. Miller, Johnson, and the other officer, Davis, stood dumbfounded, their carefully constructed facade of authority crumbling before their eyes. The silence was broken only by the relentless drumming of the rain and the crackle of the police radio. I didn't know, Miller stammered, desperately trying to salvage the situation. If I had known, I would never. Jamal cut him off, his voice cold and unforgiving. That's precisely the problem, Officer Miller. You didn't know. You saw a black man in a suspicious car and immediately jumped to conclusions. You profiled me based on my race, and you violated my rights. Ignorance is no excuse. He pulled out his phone, his fingers flying across the screen as he typed a message to his supervisor at Internal Affairs. I'm reporting this incident immediately. You will all be placed on administrative leave pending a full investigation. Davis, the youngest of the three officers, looked on the verge of tears. Sir, please don't do this. This is my first year on the force. It'll ruin my career. Jamal met his gaze, his expression unyielding. You should have thought about that before you decided to participate in this charade. You are complicit in Officer Miller's actions, and you will be held accountable. Johnson, the most seasoned of the three, attempted a different tactic. Look, Thompson, can't we just talk about this? Maybe we can come to some kind of understanding. He offered a weak, conciliatory smile. Jamal stared at him, disgusted. There's nothing to talk about, Officer Johnson. You made your choices, and now you'll face the consequences. Within minutes, a supervisor arrived on the scene, his face grim as he surveyed the situation. He spoke briefly with Jamal, listened to his account, and then turned to the three officers, his voice filled with disappointment. Miller, Johnson, Davis, you are hereby relieved of duty, effective immediately. Turn in your weapons and badges. You will be contacted regarding the next steps in the investigation. As the disgraced officers were escorted away, Jamal felt a sense of grim satisfaction. He knew that this was just the beginning of a long and arduous process, but he was determined to see it through. The next morning, the story of the traffic stop made headlines across the city. The media seized on the narrative of a black internal affairs investigator being racially profiled by his colleagues. The public outcry was immediate and intense. The police chief, a man known for his cautious and calculated approach, issued a public statement condemning the officer's actions and pledging a full and transparent investigation. He knew that the incident had the potential to severely damage the department's reputation and undermine public trust. Jamal found himself thrust into the spotlight, bombarded with interview requests and speaking invitations. He used the opportunity to highlight the systemic issues within the police department and to advocate for meaningful reforms. He spoke passionately about the need for better training, stricter accountability, and a more diverse and representative police force. However, not everyone was supportive. He received threatening phone calls and emails, some laced with racial slurs and violent imagery. He knew that he was making enemies, powerful enemies who were determined to silence him. Aisha worried constantly about his safety, urging him to take extra precautions. She even suggested that he step down from the internal affairs investigation, fearing that he was putting himself in too much danger. But Jamal refused to be intimidated. He knew that if he backed down, it would send the wrong message. It would embolden those who sought to perpetuate injustice and silence those who dared to speak out. He couldn't let that happen. He doubled down on his efforts, working tirelessly to gather evidence, interview witnesses, and build an airtight case against Miller, Johnson, and Davis. He knew that their careers were on the line, but he also knew that justice demanded accountability. As the investigation progressed, Jamal uncovered a disturbing pattern of racial profiling and abuse of power within the police department. He discovered that Miller, in particular, had a long history of targeting black residents, often using flimsy excuses to stop, search, and harass them. He also learned that Johnson and Davis were aware of Miller's behavior and had actively participated in it, either out of fear or a misguided sense of loyalty. The more he dug, the more he realized the depth and scope of the problem. The lawsuit was going to have a lot more substance. The internal affairs investigation culminated in a disciplinary hearing, a high-stakes showdown that would determine the fate of Miller, Johnson, and Davis. The hearing was held in a packed auditorium, filled with reporters, community activists, and concerned citizens. The atmosphere was tense and charged with emotion. Jamal took his seat at the prosecutor's table, his face grim and determined. He had spent weeks preparing for this moment, meticulously organizing his evidence and honing his arguments. He knew that the outcome of this hearing would have far-reaching implications, not only for the 3 officers involved but also for the entire police department. Miller, Johnson, and Davis sat at the defense table, their faces pale and drawn. They were represented by a high-powered attorney who had a reputation for defending police officers accused of misconduct. The attorney argued that the officers had acted in good faith and that their actions were justified under the circumstances. He accused Jamal of being biased and vindictive, claiming that he was using his position to settle a personal score. The hearing dragged on for hours, with witnesses testifying, evidence being presented, and arguments being exchanged. Jamal presented a compelling case, detailing the officers' history of racial profiling, their violation of departmental policies, and their disregard for the rights of citizens. He played audio recordings of Miller making disparaging remarks about black people, presented statistical data showing the disproportionate number of black drivers stopped and searched by the officers, and called witnesses who testified to the officers' abusive behavior. As the hearing drew to a close, Jamal delivered a powerful closing statement, his voice ringing with passion and conviction. "This case is not just about 3 officers," he declared. "It's about the systemic problems that plague our police department. It's about the racial bias that infects our justice system. It's about the need for accountability and reform." He looked directly at Miller, Johnson, and Davis, his eyes filled with disappointment. "You swore an oath to protect and serve all citizens, regardless of their race or background," he said. "You violated that oath. You abused your power. You betrayed the public trust. And for that, you must be held accountable." The hearing officer, a seasoned veteran of the police department, listened intently to Jamal's closing statement. He then turned to the defense attorney and allowed him to respond. The defense attorney argued that the officers were being unfairly targeted and that their actions should be viewed in the context of the difficult and dangerous job they performed. He claimed that they were being scapegoated for the failures of the entire system. After hearing all the evidence and arguments, the hearing officer retired to deliberate. The audience waited anxiously, their anticipation palpable. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the hearing officer returned. He cleared his throat and announced his decision. "After careful consideration of the evidence and arguments presented, I find that Officers Miller, Johnson, and Davis are guilty of misconduct. I recommend that Officer Miller be terminated from the police department, and that Officers Johnson and Davis be suspended without pay for 6 months." A collective gasp swept through the auditorium. Jamal felt a wave of relief wash over him. Justice had been served. But it was not the end. During the investigation, Jamal noticed some anomalies in the evidence. So he continued to dig until he found evidence that connected Miller, Johnson, and Davis to a grand scheme of corruption within the police department and city government. He presents his evidence. The hearing officer added, "Furthermore, the evidence of corruption presented to me must be investigated. If true, it will change the landscape of this city and government. I charge the officers involved and the police department cooperates fully." The aftermath of the disciplinary hearing was transformative. The police chief, under immense pressure from the public and the media, moved swiftly to implement sweeping reforms within the department. He instituted mandatory diversity training, revised the use of force policy, and established a citizen review board to oversee police conduct. Miller was fired from the police department, and faced criminal charges for his history of racial profiling and abuse of power. Johnson and Davis served their suspensions and were reassigned to desk jobs, their careers permanently tarnished. The class action lawsuit against the Cincinnati Police Department gained momentum, fueled by the evidence uncovered during the internal affairs investigation. Jamal led the charge, working tirelessly to represent the victims of racial profiling and to secure a settlement that would ensure lasting change. After months of negotiations, the city agreed to a landmark settlement, which included a commitment to implement comprehensive police reforms, pay reparations to the victims of racial profiling, and establish a community trust fund to support programs that promote racial equality. Jamal was hailed as a hero, a champion of justice who had dared to challenge the system and win. He received awards and accolades from civil rights organizations, community groups, and legal associations. Aisha, who had initially worried about his safety, was now incredibly proud of his courage and dedication. She wrote a series of articles about his work, highlighting the impact he was having on the community, and inspiring others to get involved in the fight for social justice. Jamal continued to work at the law firm, using his legal skills to advocate for the marginalized and oppressed. He also became a mentor to young lawyers, encouraging them to use their talents to make a difference in the world. He never forgot the traffic stop that had changed his life forever. It served as a constant reminder of the importance of vigilance, the need for accountability, and the power of one person to make a difference. Years later, Jamal was appointed to a federal judgeship, becoming one of the youngest and most respected judges in the country. He continued to fight for justice from the bench, ensuring that the law was applied fairly and equitably to all. One day, a young black man appeared before him, accused of a crime he didn't commit. Jamal recognized the fear and desperation in the young man's eyes, the same fear and desperation he had felt on that rainy night so many years ago. He presided over the case with impartiality and integrity, ensuring that the young man received a fair trial. In the end, the young man was acquitted, thanks to Jamal's unwavering commitment to justice. As the young man left the courtroom, he turned to Jamal and thanked him for believing in him. Jamal smiled, knowing that he had made a difference in another person's life. He knew that the fight for justice was far from over, but he also knew that progress was possible. He had seen it firsthand in the reforms he had helped to implement, in the lives he had touched, and in the hope he had inspired. The corruption investigation uncovered a network of bribery, embezzlement, and obstruction of justice that reached the highest levels of city government. Several city council members and high-ranking officials were indicted, convicted, and sentenced to prison. The city government was shaken to its core, but it emerged stronger and more transparent as a result. Jamal's actions had not only brought justice to the victims of racial profiling but had also exposed and dismantled a corrupt system that had been preying on the community for years. He had become a symbol of hope and change, a beacon of light in a city that had long been shrouded in darkness. And as he looked out at the courtroom, filled with people of all races and backgrounds, he knew that he had made a lasting impact on the world. The moral of the story is clear: injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. It is our responsibility to stand up against oppression, challenge the abuse of power, and fight for a world where everyone is treated with dignity and respect. Because when we do, we can create a more just and equitable society for all. Don't just stand by. Get involved. Be the change. Because it is time. Subscribe to be part of the movement.